So the key word I heard them talk about was how, in terms of how landscape ecology fits with NEPA, it's really storytelling. I don't think that's what the framers of the NEPA law once upon a time actually had in mind, but that's really what NEPA is all about. And I think the landscape ecology principles can help us tell that story. So we're going to move on to some personal storytellings next. My favorite part of these things, I love the science, but I also really like to hear how people are applying it. That's where the rubber meets the road. I have never read a scientific paper that told me how to do anything exactly, ever, ever, ever. So we all need to read all that stuff, synthesize that stuff, and figure out for ourselves how to move forward. And the 4 brave examples that you're going to hear from this afternoon are going to share their experience doing that. So the first one up is the Rigdon Dry Forest Landscape Analysis and Design Project. And Alan Hambrick, who is a planner on the Willamette National Forest, and Jane Kertis, who is an ecologist with the Northwest Oregon Ecology Group, are going to tag team the discussion on that. And I'd also add, you should all be challenged to go home and hug your ecologist too. This morning we talked about soil scientists, so you got a couple of hugs on your list. So find your ecologist as well. So help me welcome, please, Alan and Jane.
There it is.
I'm Jane, in case you were wondering, and I'm an ecologist, and I want to know, I'm feeling the love. It's great. But I do want to point out, and there was a discussion earlier on who's in charge and who should be leading the charge in terms of landscape ecology and application. And I really want to say that, yes, as ecologists, I know we play a role, but it really takes a village, or maybe more of a megapolis, to really see it through effectively. Before we get started talking about the Rigdon area, I did want to point out, given that megapolis, I would like everyone that was involved in the Rigdon landscape analysis and project planning to raise your hand. And I know there are several of you that are out in internet land, so raise your hand too. So that gives you an idea of the fact that it's just not 1 or 2 people in a black box, but it really takes all of us. So I'm going to give a little bit of context. It all started way back in 2000 when a crusty old Middle Fork District silviculturist, Tim Bailey, was out poking around in the landscape, and he found some really interesting landscape features at the south end of the forest. He found, on the south-facing aspect, he found very dense Douglas fir and incense cedar younger cohorts mixed in with older cohorts of pretty puny-looking ponderosa pine and sugar pine. And then also mixed in with that were these dead, standing, and down Oregon white oak. The other thing he found was a variety of meadows, meadow complexes across the area, and the larger ones had remnant Oregon white oak and ponderosa pine in them, and the smaller ones were becoming encroached with Douglas fir, but did have remnant Oregon white oak around them that were not doing very well either. So he brought this back to the district, and we decided to do something a little bit different. We convened a relatively informal group of, or collaborative, which was made up of a broad range of stakeholders. And we talked about it. We said we have this really interesting conundrum that we want feedback on. You know, what should we do? We looked in the Government Land Office survey records and found that this particular portion of the landscape around the mid-1800s was a large savanna. So after lots of discussion about whether that was a valuable landscape feature to think about, we decided, in fact, that yes, that is what we wanted to do. So thus began and completed the Jims Creek savanna restoration project that you can see the before and the after, where we were able to restore, I'm going to say, savanna-like conditions across about 450 acres of the area. And some people thought, yay, that's a landscape project. However, in continuing to poke around, we found that we definitely needed to take a much bigger view to really understand the landscape. So thus began, it only took us close to 10 years, but thus began our Rigdon landscape analysis. We decided to use to take that bigger picture view. We used the most southerly 4 sub-watersheds to encompass our landscape analysis area, roughly about 100,000 acres. And one of the reasons why we picked this was because Jim's Creek kind of showed us the way at the finer scale, but really that whole landscape area is an area where there's a lot of mixing. It's a transition zone. So we saw mixed conifer forests that were much more common to the south, intermixing with more mesic conifer forests that are much more common to the north. And so because of that, it also, there also was a wide variety of terrestrial wildlife habitat conditions that either were currently available or had some opportunity to become available. It also was home to 2 different threatened fish species, and it's really a mecca from a people perspective, both from a recreational as well as a economic supply perspective. And this time, we actually had a very interested and excited formal collaborative that had expressed a lot of interest in working with us to understand this landscape, and it's something that we actually could do together, which was really an appealing part of this process. So it's interesting that this was mentioned before. We decided to use the forest landscape analysis and design approach. There's a lot of landscape analysis approaches out there, and although they're a little bit different, they really have a lot of commonality in terms of the concepts that they use to arrive at the analysis. And we also liked it because we really need to meet people where they are in terms of their understanding of ecological principles and concepts and how to move forward. And this seemed to really give us the best opportunity to do that. The other reason why we liked it was that there were lots of places, a lot of steps where we really had an opportunity to work directly with the collaborative. So that was appealing as well. So although there's 8 steps to the process, I've kind of boiled them down to kind of 4 general categories. In the first 5 steps, we really focused on trying to understand the landscape. So to really explore what elements of the landscape were important, to look at what flows and sometimes barriers to flows there were across the landscape, to think about what the driving forces were controlling landscape function and pattern. And then we looked at that, again, getting back to the HRV, NRV, we actually looked at that through time. So we basically looked at it starting in historical times and looked at how that might change through time up to the current condition, and then again had a lot of conversations around what that meant moving into the future as well. And then the next step, we really focused a lot on looking to the plethora of plans that we had, that to see if they provided us any sideboards or direction around landscape pattern. And given those 2 basic steps, then, we worked on really developing what we wanted to see in terms of our desired landscape pattern on the landscape and how it might change, depending on where you are within the landscape. And then the thought was, once we completed this analysis, then it would be available to several project planning areas. So working with the collaborative, we came up with several kind of landscape threads that we wanted to use. And those were vegetation, wildlife habitat, aquatics, physical environments, humans, and fire. And I told Cheryl, 15 minutes is not enough time to go through this entire analysis process, so I'm going to just jam through and give you an example of one of our elements, or one of our themes, let's say, and that's vegetation. So in order to really think about what our key elements were, we really looked to in a few different places. The first thing we really wanted to look at was what are the types and distribution of the biophysical environments across the landscape? And that's where we really tried to, as Karen talked about earlier, look at the relationship between the physical environment and plant distribution. And we use the potential vegetation to help us do that. So what you can see here is this landscape is actually quite varied with the low elevation, warmer, drier biophysical environments supporting the Douglas fir and grand fir types. And then moving into the more mesic western hemlock, Pacific silver fir, and even the mountain hemlock sites at our coolest areas. So there's quite a bit of variability. Another thing we wanted to look at was what are the suite of compositional and structural conditions that we've seen across the landscape through time. And so we were most interested in looking at that within the confines of each of the potential vegetation types. And so we call these seral stages. And then we also were not just interested in the forest, but we were also interested in what kind of non-forest habitat there was across the landscape. The next step for us was for us to really think about what are the driving forces that really are responsible for, or have been responsible for landscape pattern across our landscape. And we did spend some time talking about the role of wind, insects, and pathogens, and people. I'm going to focus my example on fire. Because I'm a fire ecologist, and also because fire really probably was the most dominant landscape driver across the landscape, probably across almost all landscapes. We were lucky in that James Johnston, who's a research associate at Oregon State University, had begun doing a fire history study in portions of this landscape as we were working through the process. And although he's not finished, we were able to use some of his preliminary results. And what we found was that there really is quite a range of historical fire frequencies that have exhibited themselves across the landscape, and that those are very strongly linked to the distribution of vegetation types. We heard an earlier speaker, I think it was Tom, allude to that, and in fact it did prove to be true in this landscape as well. In the hottest, driest types that really were largely ponderosa pine and Oregon white oak, you can see there's a very frequent historical mean fire return interval of 5 years. And in talking about that, and in talking about the role of people as well, we were able to postulate that we think that indigenous people probably played a pretty big role in especially the warmer, drier environments in this landscape. We also had some evidence, as you can see here, in that many of the large ponderosa pine across most of the mixed conifer landscape showed signs of being culturally modified. So that is not a fire scar, that is a cultural modification of the ponderosa pine. We also found in those areas that the high frequency, we assumed, I think correctly, was associated with the low severity regime. And then as we moved into the moister and cooler types, where the fire return interval got longer and longer, we knew partly from this study, but also from other fire history studies that have been done in the area, that those probably was associated with a mixed severity fire regime. So as you can imagine, we kind of broke those out as to kind of two general environments, and those would produce very different landscape patterns, with the mixed conifer vegetation type really showing a fabric probably of open forest condition, maybe in later seral stages, with a finer grained variability in terms of seral stages. And here you can see from age class and density as well, as opposed to the mixed severity fire regime, which probably supported a connected late seral landscape, but had some fine to medium grain variability across the landscape. So what we tried to do then was to really think about, to get away from that conundrum of restoring to what year or whatever. We really tried to talk a lot about function and what kind of functions did this landscape provide on the landscape, provide to us through time, and what kind of functions then did we want to have it continue to provide. So here's just a big list of at least the historical functions that this landscape provided. It obviously produced carbon, it produced an array of wildlife habitats, it stored carbon as well, it cycled water, it output coarse woody debris, and also wildlife species moving outside of this landscape into adjacent landscapes. So we looked at the changing role of driving forces through time as well, and definitely could see a change in the driving force of fire. The removal of indigenous people from this landscape and around the mid-1800s, then followed by a pretty active fire suppression policy, really changed the role of fire on this landscape. As you can see from this map here, here's our landscape area. Although we do see several larger fires that occurred since 1970 in the landscape, we also have a plethora of these points here, which represent ignitions that never grew to much because we actively suppressed them. So I would have you ponder what this landscape might look like if some of these plethora of points moved beyond a suppressed state. Another key driver that's changed in more recent times is this very active timber management program that we have. And you can see the result of that in our current landscape process, where in the mixed conifer landscape, which is located here, we see big patches of the light green is early seral, the dark green is late seral closed, and the yellow is mid-seral closed canopy. And so we can see in the mixed conifer area, we're looking at large patches of late seral closed canopy or early seral closed canopy. And in the moist forests, we're seeing definitely a lack of connectivity across some of the landscape in terms of late seral. And we're seeing the effects of land ownership as well on landscape pattern. And these red dots here represent patches of very complex late seral forest. So you can see that those are also very disjunct. So one thing we did is we really looked, as we walked through this story with each resource, is to really look at how each element interacted with other resource themes. And so we built these webs, and this is just an example of kind of the late seral stage element. And we built these webs so that we could understand how one resource or one element of one resource could interact either as a flow or a barrier or in a positive or a negative to all the other resources. As I said, we went through our plans. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that, just to mention that one of them was the potential difference between how we manage the matrix portion of our landscape versus the late seral, the LSR portion of our landscape. And then we developed these landscape pattern narratives, where we tried to develop pictures of what those might look like, and we have pages of these. So this is just one example showing that we're recognizing and desire a different landscape pattern in our mixed conifer forest area versus our moist, cool area, and how that might look on the landscape. And since I don't have very much time, I'm not going to go into it anymore. Okay, now I'm handing it off to Alan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, so the Rigdon landscape analysis project to planning, and quite simply put, you went through the effort, you have this landscape analysis, you should use it. And so that's exactly what we're doing. So it'll be used for this particular current project. We have here, I would point it out, I don't know which one to push. There we go. So we have the Young's Rock Rigdon project, which Suzanne mentioned earlier, and it's this yellow area here, and this is our analysis area. So we can continue to use this analysis for future projects. That's really one of the main points you want to take away here, is that a lot of effort went into this, and we're going to continue to use it. So the landscape goals and objectives that were just shown a second ago, those target patterns and those objectives, you know, that fed right into developing our purpose and need. And I can tell you, when we got done with this, and I thought, okay, I'm gonna write up a draft purpose and need, and I struggled a little bit. And so I went around asking people, and I said, why are you struggling? It's all right here. It's right there. It's those objectives and those targets that you're looking for. And so it was lifted right out of there, almost word for word. So this project's about 33,000 acres, and we'll continue to go with this. So just quickly have a look at, you know, the bulleted points of the EIS, Young's Rock Rigdon, and the purpose and need that came out of it. And, you know, not any one of these are more important than the other. It's all taken as a whole. And so planning in the past, you know, a project proponent would come up and they would have a particular thing you wanted to look at, and then you would build a project around it. And we think that this really didn't go that route, and that we looked at everything up front and tried to incorporate it all under the same importance. And so talking about those patterns and what was shown in the landscape analysis, this is you know, one of the first maps that have developed out of there. And here is what we're talking about, the mixed conifer here. This is that down in here in the green. And this map, the pattern that you see there is described in the landscape analysis. And what you're seeing here is a pine sticking out, and this is the bottom of that pine within one of these stands over here. And again, it started, really started with this years ago. And while, you know, our project now is using this as, you know, as kind of a guide, it's going to be different because it was planned differently. And so there's going to be a lot more incorporated into this. We want to increase the diversity and structure in upland managed stands as well. And you know, this will be focused on our 40 to 60-year-old plantations, and we'll also get into creating some complex early seral here, as well as late seral patch connectivity, which is, again, all talked about in the analysis. We get into the meadows and the oaks, and plenty of meadows out there. They're being encroached. We're going to work on those. And then when we find the oak savanna, or the, you know, the enclosed oaks, you know, this is one of those areas that has been found before. You know, they're still out there, and we'll find more. Aquatics, you know, I mean, how important is water? It's unbelievably important. And so we have a lot of floodplain restoration that will happen, and has already happened in the area. And what's interesting is that we've had projects happen there. Jims Creek, this is Staley Creek, floodplain restoration that you see here. All of these are fitting that pattern now that the landscape analysis was showing us. And it's interesting how those different the plans and the watershed analysis and the LSR analysis, it really came that we used them and they came to get to where we wanted to be here, and that's with this, the aquatics piece, it's really obvious. And then the control the stocking and improve structural complexity of diversity of riparian vegetation and complexity restoration needed to attain aquatic conservation strategy objectives. And again, this is a very important piece of the project. Strategically reduce hazardous fuels. This is including underburns and roadside fuel breaks. There's a lot that can be done, and hopefully will be done here in the future with this. Another important piece are, we took the people into account a lot here, the recreation that goes on, and the historical education opportunities that came out a lot with the collaborative, and when we were, having meetings with them that, we really, the area down there is to the Willamette a unique area, and so we need to maybe better describe what has happened there and what can happen there. And so there's going to be, as a part of the project, some upkeep of the trails, some more description of what happened there historically as well. And roads, sustainable road system, it's a big piece, very important to a lot of our interest groups. And then, a sustainable supply of forest products in the area has a lot that can be offered. So, I guess the biggest take home for me is that, the potential future projects using the RLA. And so we've identified a few other areas. We're not even, hardly into Young's Rock, and we're thinking out ahead. So we've got a couple of other areas that we can get into soon enough. And then, any other sort of NEPA that comes up out there, whether it's a floodplain restoration or anything, if it's a CE of some sort, recreation, we can reference this rigged landscape analysis and keep applying it. Questions? That's it.
We have time for questions for Alan and Jane.
RLA assessment, that was just a white paper or a publication. It wasn't part of the NEPA decision.
It's not a decision, it's a...
Repeat the question if you would.
Oh, is the RLA a decision document?
Yeah, or just like a white paper.
It's a guiding document, but it references, all of our plans, watershed analysis. It's all in there. It was all taken into account, that, and so we use it to then do NEPA projects, which will have a decision applied.
It's like a white paper. It's like a white
Because you
paper.
run into, well, that was a part of the decision, and so now
Yeah.
it's been X amount of years, and you can't use that information.
No.
Okay.
No, I think
It's been outdated.
kind of, we'll go out 20 years, who knows how much time as we kind of round the horn of that landscape area, and we'll have to reassess at some point. Have we hit that pattern, and we'll see.
Did it go through a public engagement process outside of working with your collaboratives, similar to what a NEPA document would go through?
Not exactly.
So, repeat.
Oh, did it go through a public engagement process, the Rigdon landscape analysis? And no, it was, but it was widely talked about amongst our interest groups, and the collaborative was very open to having anyone come, and our meetings were open to anyone that was interested in showing up.
Well, and I also have to mention, we did lots of field trips.
Oh,
And
yeah.
the collaborative was part of that, but really was more of an open invitation, and correct me if I'm wrong, Dwayne, in terms of anyone could come and could engage in conversation around it. So I would say maybe in a less formal way, we did engage not just the collaborative, but a broader group of people as well.
One more.
And just kind of feeding into our previous panel discussion, how much time did you invest in this assessment, and how much time do you think it's going to save you in the future as you're supporting for some of these future projects that you're already looking at?
Well,
Repeat the question.
Oh, the question was, how much time did it take, and how much efficiency did we see in using this approach, right?
And do you think you'll see it in the future?
And do we think we'll see it in the, okay, do we think we'll see it in the future? Well, I can answer the first one if I think I know what you're asking. We've actually already started another landscape analysis project on the McKenzie district. So I think there was a sense of success from it, and folks wanted to, at least our forest folks wanted to see it happen again. And then the question about efficiency, I think Alan mentioned we did, and I think this is key recommendation to make, is that do the landscape analysis at the appropriate scale. And so I think we chose perhaps the appropriate scale. It was bigger than a project level scale, so this analysis is going to prove useful for at least two other, besides the Young's Rock Rigdon, at least two other
Large-scale projects.
large-scale projects.
Which
And-
we should be able to jump right into, getting closer to rounding the top of that NEPA triangle as opposed to starting at square one. I think it's going to buy us a lot of efficiency and time.
And I forgot the third one, the third prong of your question. Oh, how long did it take? Okay, so we decided to do a protracted approach with this in that we met with ID teams on a monthly basis, and so it ended up taking us over a year to actually complete it. However, when we calculated the number of hours, it ended up taking us 3 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks total. So we learned a lot from this approach, and so working with the 3D project, which I think you heard Suzanne mention is the next project, we're taking a slightly different tack, and we're actually trying to work through the process over a much shorter time period. I think that's really a much better idea, because we ended up every month having to review with people what we had done the previous month, and it just really didn't end up being that efficient. However, it was helpful to use that with the collaborative, because I think we were able to bring them along, or we were brought along together in terms of figuring out what this landscape was all about and figuring out how we wanted to move forward with it. So I think the approach really depends on who you're working with and what you're hoping to get out of it.
Help me thank these guys, everybody.
See you later.